Good afternoon. This is the People's View. Today is August 29th, 2019. My name is Bill Ohm. I'll be your host for this panel. And with me are my good friends. First, Carl Seidel.
I was a rep for 4 years at the Public Works Committee. And
Doris Hohensee, I'm a school board member.
And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Barbara Griffin. I'm a current rep. I'm in my third term. I was former Speaker Pro Tem up at the House when the Republicans were in the majority, and I continue to serve up there this term.
And today the big topic is the budget. We are in the process of having the budgets renegotiated between the governor, the House, and the Senate. And Barbara, you've been following this very closely. What's your take on the situation?
Thanks for asking that. I think it is a big question, but I think one of the things that people don't realize is that the budget at the State House, while it's way more money, is a little bit like what you have to do in your house. And in the state, there is actually a constitutional obligation for the governor to pass a balanced budget. So really what's going on up at the State House right now is a disagreement over what's a balanced budget. And we estimate revenues, you know about that, having served on Ways and Means as to what the revenues are going to be. And we allocate money for ongoing programs, and we have money that we know is one-time money that we allocate for programs that are not necessarily going to be reoccurring. And there's been a breakdown up in the State House in regards to what the revenues are going to be and what those kind of revenues should be used for. But people have been working really hard to try and resolve those differences. And I think the goal is to come to some sort of an agreement within the next month.
well, September 19th is when you're going to have a hold a session up there, aren't you?
Carl, that's right. There are actually 2 days scheduled for legislators to come back in September. And so if the teams that are up there working on the budget now can reach some sort of an agreement, I expect that we'll see it on one of those 2 days.
I heard one other thing, too, is that they're looking at how much money is going to be left or gained more than on the taxes, more than they had planned. And I guess it's not as much as it was last year. Is that right?
Well, Bill knows that you try to estimate your revenues, and you're estimating them a long time before they happen. And it turns out, I think all of us have read that the revenues for last month, and we're expecting this month, are actually going to be less than what is in the budget. So we had sort of a difference up there about $40 million as to whether or not it should have been in the budget to begin with. And now we're looking at revenues which might be down, which was entirely expected. We knew that we were going to peak out. Some people said it was going to be next year. It looks like net this year. We still don't have a completely clear picture, but clearly there's not as much money coming in as some people had hoped for.
That might make it even harder to balance the budget.
Well, not necessarily, because the numbers that the governor used in putting together the budget were the House Ways and Means numbers, which were a bipartisan number that was used in the governor's budget. Now, when it came through the rest of the process, the Democrats had jacked up that number to a much higher level. And the latest news is that the number that's coming in is really close to the Ways and Means number.
Oh, really? Okay.
Now, there's another factor that's going on with this, which is the federal tax law. Under federal tax laws, a corporation can prepay state taxes and deduct that. Now, if you're a business that's going to have your taxes go down, you'd like to take as much deductions as you can when the taxes are high, and then recover those when the taxes are lower at the federal level. So what we thought was happening in the Ways and Means process was that the corporations were putting in a little extra back in the 2016, 2017 time period, so that they would get a better federal tax break. And now that things are settled on the federal level, they're paying a little less in estimated taxes than what they would normally pay. And I think that's part of the shortfall, because we operate on a cash basis, as Barbara points out.
Well, that's, I bet you a lot of people don't know that.
Yeah, it's one of those subtle things that the Ways and Means Committee is pretty good at looking at. Norm Major in particular, who's our expert in the House, and the Senate relies on him as well for the proper estimates. And he has a good working relationship with the opposition party in Ways and Means. So the numbers that the committee comes up with on House Ways and Means is usually a very, very solid number.
I remember that they're very good in coming up with numbers, and amazingly accurate.
Yeah. So we have this budget impasse coming up. To my perspective, it seems to me that it's not really a bad problem to have if we have this continuing resolution that flatlines the spending, because we've already funded some additional money for Health and Human Services. That's outside the budget, so we have some increase for that. And if we flatline the spending, is that really such a bad thing?
Well, I think that it depends on your perspective, because I know some people were anticipating revenue that was in the budget that didn't get passed, and one of those things, of course, is the school. Our local schools count on a lot of money from the state, and I know different communities are looking at it differently. The governor's budget had building aid in it. He was using that to use some of that one-time money that wasn't going to be reoccurring. The budget that came out of the committee from primarily the Democrats. One of the committees really did have only Democrats on it. They didn't have building aid, they had more adequacy aid in it, but it was money that was not reoccurring, and there's a real concern that from a local level, and Doris could probably speak to that more, that you start having money come in and it's not a sure thing every year. You don't want to be building a budget relying on it.
No, you have to take your resources that you know are coming in to set your budget. If you get additional grants during the year, you can always reallocate where you're spending some of the money. But again, like the state, you have to use the sources and the numbers that you know are reliable. And the city just found $5 million more at the end of the overall budget, not just the school district, which is a big portion. So they came in pretty close, but it's always nice to come in on the positive side. There's some years that you come in on the negative side, things have to be pushed around and to make it balance. So.
Did the mayor give the Board of Education money?
I think he's divided up. It was in the paper.
Yeah, it's divided up, but I didn't
I-
see anything in there for the...
I didn't see a
For the
big amount
schools.
for the school, but he did give us a bigger percentage than the other departments at the original time of budgeting. There's usually the level of whatever the cap is that we don't talk about anymore, but we usually get a little bit more than that. So he's usually pretty generous right from the onset to the schools, as well as he can, given the numbers he's got.
Yeah, because I was wondering about the salary cap the spending cap that Nassau had in place at one time, which was then blown through by the alderman and the mayor, challenged in court, and it was rejected by the court saying it's not enforceable. So I guess we are spending more than we had planned originally through the budgeting process for the city. And
I don't think they spent more than the cap. What they did is they took $9 million out of the budget, which gave them a lot more room to spend. And even though it looked like that we're keeping to the cap. So there was never a need for an override vote, because even when the Republicans were on the Board of Aldermen, because we stayed under, having pulled out things and dropped them elsewhere. So I don't know if they're going to do that again or if that was a one-time thing. But it was sort of a roundabout play to the spending cap.
Okay.
That was when they pulled out one section of the budget and compared it then to something else that had it in it before. So it was a little bit
little smoke and mirrors with the budgeting?
Yeah, a little shell game there,
Yeah.
but that didn't bother the judges.
Okay.
So.
So what's the current state of the education department in Nashua?
Well, we've got 5 new seats up for bid in November. We've got 3 candidates have already filed. I expect that there'll be a dozen at least
Oh, good.
for those 5 seats. It'll be unlike other years where you have 5 seats, 5 candidates. It'll be more contested because it's been very contested on our board. My biggest problem is getting the administration to follow the rule of law, like state laws, board policies. Like just the last meeting, we had a $35,000 contract that we didn't put out to bid. Anything over $5,000 goes out to bid. They had reasons, and they might have been good, but it should have been gone out to bid and shown that this was. We should have had an override vote for our policy. We didn't have either. They just passed it. So it's that disregard for our own policies and state law that has a couple of us in the minority sort of pulling our hair out, quietly.
You have a lot of things going on at the Board of Education. I mean, you got a new way of teaching the children coming on. It's a strategic plan, and then I understand that you have a severe shortage of English as a second language teachers.
The federal government's investigating whether or not we have sufficient personnel
Teachers,
for
yeah.
English language learners. We call it ELL.
Okay.
We've got in the strategic plan 5 new ones coming in over the next 10 years. We could have fully funded them this year. I made a proposal to charge a nominal amount if you had a full day of kindergarten as opposed to a half day, like other districts do. It was $200 a month I proposed. They could change that. But it was getting in some money, and then I said, you can take that money and fully fund your ELLs, fully fund the paras, get what you need for grades 1 to 12, which are mandatory. Let's fund those fully and give them an adequate education. Kindergarten, which is optional, shouldn't be taking all our resources on an optional basis and depriving the kids. So that fell. It was like 6-3. I think myself, Mr. Kaufman, and Mrs. Van Twyver voted to take in the money, and so we didn't get it. So now we've got the federal investigation to see that we're providing for English language learners. But we're a welcoming city, so we welcome outsiders of different languages, different backgrounds, and do we have the resources to provide for them? We also have another change that I was mentioning to you earlier, that we're not sending our special ed teachers to the charter schools. We're demanding that they be bused to our public schools, which kills their class time. They did an audit, and maybe this saves money, but I asked for a breakdown. How much money are we saving? Because it should be students first in class time. So previous years they would say, okay, you need a part-time special ed teacher, we'll give you the funds, you hire somebody, and then we don't have to send personnel. So the transit problem was solved that way. So it could be that this is the way to do it, but we've got some angry parents in our city that are like, all of a sudden, the first week back to school, my kid is losing 90 minutes a day being transported and not getting his regular class time. So I'm trying to get some answers to that.
That sounds like a good idea to me. The article I saw on the teachers is that some teachers had as many as 40, 50 children.
Oh, up to, yeah, for the ELL.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is they don't learn all the different languages. They only know English. The student comes to them and learns English. So it's different than what you might expect. And they don't have the 49 at once. They'll break it up over the course of the day, but they're expected to have a certain percentage of their day in language instruction
I see.
and then in regular instruction. So there's certain guidelines that we're supposed to follow. I believe we're following it. I don't know if there's a class size restriction. I know in our union contracts we say how many kids can be in a kindergarten versus a third versus an 8th grade. So I believe we were following, good practices there.
So it's just the time, there's a piece of the day that they have the English.
They either pull them out individually from a class or they have a separate class. So it works different ways, whether you're at the elementary level, the middle school, or high school level. So there's no one answer to that question.
I had a question about the enrollment in Nashville Public Schools. Is that increasing, flatlining, or declining?
It's declining. It was like 12,000. It's closer to 11,000. Now in the past 2 or 3 years, it's gone down. And that's one of the concerns about the middle school, which we sent over to the joint committee for the aldermen and the school board to evaluate and give us a report back. It's been 15 months and we haven't gotten a report back. It is a complex question, but what started out as an Elm Street Middle School question is now said we need to give equity to the other middle schools, Pennachuck and Fairgrounds, and give them all new facilities or upgrade all their facilities and equalize them. It used to be, there's more in Elm Street, it's a bigger school. The others were smaller schools. They want to equalize, the administration wants to equalize them, which means expanding them. In a declining enrollment, is that the wisest thing to do? But the report hasn't come back to the full board, so we can't speak to that. We're sitting there and waiting, hoping that we'll get a report back before a final decision is made. Some people, and this was brought up at our last meeting, and they're investigating, some people think it doesn't have to come to the full board. We sent it to them for review, and we're done. but that's not historically the way Mrs. Van Twyver remembers it, being on the board for several terms.
From a taxpayer perspective, if we've got declining enrollment, I think the taxpayers would expect the school budgets to reflect that declining enrollment and not be expanding the budgets.
Well, expanding the budgets and expanding the buildings are two different things. There are more requirements in regulation, and we are having more students, say, on the autistic spectrum that require more services. Those numbers are increasing. Mm-hmm. So it's difficult to say that your budgets should decrease because your students decrease. They may need more services. But I don't understand why we need bigger schools if we have declining enrollment. That puzzles, I think, just about everybody.
Do they have a timetable in deciding what they're going to be doing with these middle schools, especially Elm Street? Is there a schedule that you're following? It's just...
We're waiting for a report back. You can't, they're having architects review and appraise, and they're working with them and going to give estimates, and then a decision needs to be made what direction to go in. There's also 2 elementary schools, I think, that have the open concept, and they were thinking whether or not they would modify those. I don't know if that's going to go before the middle school projects. It's all balancing out how much we can bond at a certain time. But we haven't heard much on the board. It's sort of like been pushed off. That's one of the big problems. Even the strategic plan, they pushed it off the board. It's a board responsibility by statute. And they had an ad hoc committee with the newest member of the whole board, who was on there a month, and she was delegated to be the liaison. Well, that's come and gone. But the point is, we're not, as a board, getting involved in the issues the way we should. This new majority likes to delegate away the authority to someone else.
Well, we've talked about the elections coming up for the school board. And Doris, you're running again for the school board?
I was thinking about it, and I'm definitely running again. I'm just going to get the petitions and see if we can put together a team that is interested in respecting parents, respecting our policies, and following the law. It's very simple.
We certainly have some excellent ideas, Doris, and I wish you well with that.
Well, thank you.
Elections are another topic that I'd like to talk about.
Well, I think we get back to the budget. I just want to understand something. My understanding is that the governor has really formed a number that he wants to keep the budget within, and essentially he said, well, we can just, all these things that can't be included at the numbers that were proposed by the Democrats, if you just shave one of them, but you can shave them the way you want. Is that the approach he's taking?
Well, you and I may have heard the same interview that the governor did. I haven't had a personal discussion with him, but I think he's looking at it as the chief operating officer for the state, and he's saying, I have an obligation to balance this budget, and as long as you balance it and you're providing at least the services that I think need to be provided, whether or not we fund, DCYF has new positions, whether we fund, 177 or 77, that's sort of your decision as an elected policymaker. So, I suspect that's part of the approach he's taking. I think that, it's a big budget, and not everybody's going to agree on every dollar. Even budgets that, the majority of the school board might agree on part of it, but other parts of it don't get agreed to. So I think he's trying to get to a number that everybody can agree on.
What's the difference? Do you know what the Democrats want and what the Republicans want? And
as far as the total number?
Yeah, the total number.
Well, there are a couple of things going on with that. There was a $42 million that was put into spending, that there was a disagreement as to the fact that whether or not that should be there at all. And the 3 principal issues that I think you might have heard about were the Family Medical Leave Act that was in there as an income tax. It was referred to as an assessment. The reality it is everybody would have paid a percentage of their wage to fund the proposed Family Medical Leave Act. I think that's been pulled out of the budget as it's being discussed now, but things get pulled out and can be put back in. And we know the governor proposed a different plan in conjunction with the state of Vermont for that. There is also the issue of a capital gains tax to close. It was portrayed as an effort to close a loophole It's a new tax. I mean, it's not closing a loophole, and it's not something that we've had here before. And Bill, having served on Ways and Means, knows how receptive our businesses were to a capital gains. The answer would be not, because they
Again,
pay taxes, and
Yeah.
we want to try and keep it friendly. And then the last one is the issue over we're level funding a business enterprise tax. There were scheduled tax reductions that were done. Bill's very familiar with those from his work on Ways and Means. And there is one side of the coin, primarily the Democrat side, saying we're not going to do the cuts this year. And the people on the other side are saying we're already doing the cuts. They went into effect January 1st. People are paying taxes based on that rate. If you bump up to the old rate, it's a tax increase. And that's a big issue for a lot of businesses who have already been
But
paying.
I think the governor did give in on the next cut that was planned but not implemented yet.
Well, and I think that goes with his philosophy of
Right.
businesses need to be able to anticipate what's going on, and if they've
Right.
already made a business plan for this business year based on those tax rates, we can't change it on them.
Right.
There's also the trend on the taxes, because we've had one of the highest corporate taxes in
Right.
the country at 7.9%, which are knocking down in stages. And the last stage of that tax cut is in statute. And the budget that the House and Senate has proposed is to not only reverse that tax cut, but to then grab back some of the taxes that are currently being paid, as you've pointed out. So it's a really tough situation. I think you and I ran businesses before, Carl, and as you point out, we like to have certainty so we can do some decent planning. If you're going to expand or hire people, you want to know what your bottom line is going to look like. And I think mucking up with the existing law, which is what the House and Senate conferees would like to do, I think is very, very bad policy.
Well, I think that's what I was getting to. The tax cut has really just increased our business in New Hampshire. Things are booming
Yeah.
here. We have so many openings, we can't find the people, to do
Right.
that.
You can argue about the Laffer curve, which says, well, if you tax zero, you get no dollars. If you tax 100%, you get no dollars. So somewhere in the middle is kind of
right.
the optimum tax rate. And I think what we saw from this experiment with lowering the business taxes, we've got more business tax revenue from a lower tax rate.
I'm seeing a lot more businesses come up here too than have been recently, and I think that we're becoming a little bit better known as the place to go to start up a business. Because most of our stuff is relatively small businesses. We don't have too many gigantic businesses like BAE.
Well, we're working on them. We have this regenerative manufacturing project
Right.
up in Manchester, which
That's
I
right.
hope does well for all of us and could easily expand into Nashville, as well as part of the northern counties.
But I think that's what we're becoming known as, a good place to start.
Yeah, yeah. Tax friendly, great environment, nice people.
Nice environment.
And it's also a nice environment for a lot of people to want to vote in our elections. Sometimes we think it might be too nice because we have some of the loosest election laws in the country. And Barbara Griffin, as chair of election law in the past couple of terms, has spearheaded the efforts to tighten up these election laws. And now we see several bills that are passed by the House and Senate and vetoed by the governor. And these bills would tend to redo the hard work that Barbara and her committee has done on reforming the elections. Do you want to talk a bit about the election law that we currently have and some of the risks we have if these vetoes don't get sustained?
Thank you. Well, I mean, the elections, who should vote in elections is an amazingly difficult question in New Hampshire that seems to be pretty straightforward everywhere else. It's sort of a conundrum how it got to be so complicated here. But the bottom line is, over the last 10 years, it has gotten complicated. And I think the reality is it's because it's gotten really political in this state. We're a long, skinny state with lots of borders. We have states and a country on our side. There's been anecdotal evidence that people come from Canada. And I'm saying anecdotal. So people, and these states around us are sort of blue states, and we've been historically a red state. So There's talk about, whether people are coming here to try to affect the election. And, Doris wants people voting in Nashua on the people who represent the people
Right.
in Nashua, because they're the people who are setting the budgets and are going to affect the tax rate and the children in their communities. So I think there's always an interest in having people vote in your community who should be. It's not like we vote on a national budget where we all have the same interest, right? We vote on our proportionately elected representatives. We have representatives for us to speak in the Congress, in the Senate, and we have a representative piece of how we elect a president, right? It's not a national popular vote, it's a representative piece. So anyways, over time, what's happened is there have been a couple of changes in our Constitution and a couple of changes in statute that led to the fact that one year our Secretary of State's office actually got a call from somebody in California and said, hey, I just heard I can vote in your election. And he sort of explained what it is, but the headline was essentially, you don't have to live in New Hampshire to vote here, and that's what the person in California had.
We've spent many years getting these laws into where everybody who's going to vote had the same conditions to meet, right?
Right.
Which worked hard. And then this year, legislation was passed, which has been vetoed, to eliminate some of those
Right.
laws. Do you think we're going to have a problem? They're going to have a problem overturning those vetoes?
I am always hesitant to speculate on what 400 people are going to do when they get together.
You've been there too long already.
Someone once said, what do you suppose that vote meant? I just sort of looked at them and said, I can repeat the vote tally for you. It speaks for itself. I can't speak for everybody up there. So
It's interesting, isn't it? It's an interesting time.
Well, what's interesting is that the issue was not laid to rest, and that it was chosen to pass legislation essentially reversing when we have ongoing litigation on those very same bills. So some election law reform bills were passed last session, and litigation was quickly filed on both of them. One of them people might have referred to on Senate Bill 3 that has to do with proving you live where you live. And I'm using the term live purposely. Domicile and residence becomes sort of the legal term of art, but I think for myself, for you, it's where do you live?
Where do you live?
Right? So,
Look at your driver's license. Where do you live?
are you on vacation or where do you live, right? And so there was SB 3 worked on having to prove where you live, right? When you went to the town clerk's office, when I went so many years ago now, I can't remember, to register, you had to show who you were, right? You need to show who you were, you're a citizen, and that you're in the right place to be voting.
Right.
Pretty simple.
Right.
Well, in New Hampshire, we don't have to show that we're in the right place. And there are a lot of other rules, like you don't even have to show an identification that's related in any way to New Hampshire to vote. And so SB 3 sought to tighten that up, that you had to show some proof. Massachusetts, for example, to our south, requires you to show some proof that you are in fact living where you say you're living to be voting at that place. States have different rules. They can set that ballot aside if you don't have the proof, so you can go home and come back with it. We don't have that provision in New Hampshire. If you cast a vote, it's counted. So there are some little intricacies, but that's what Senate Bill 3 did, and we were promptly sued by the League of Women Voters and a couple of plaintiffs in regards to that, and that's been ongoing in the Superior Court for, I think, almost two years probably now. There is a out-of-state Washington law firm that's really driving that. There's been a number of continuances, and that litigation is still going on.
Yeah.
So the law was enacted. We used the new law in the elections, but there's now an injunction on using it anymore. There were no problems that we're aware of using the new law in the last election, but after the election was over, the court ruled you can't use it until we have a trial and go through the litigation process. So there's that piece. And then you mentioned two bills, right? There are two. There's another one that some people refer to, they think of it as being a licensing bill. It's actually a change in a statute that says, reaffirms essentially what we understand the rule to be, that if you move here after a certain amount of days, you're supposed to change your registration and your license. And now, and what the law changes would make it clear that if you're voting, then you're making a representation that you live here, you're domiciled here, and that therefore you need to comply with the motor vehicle laws. You don't need to register your car or change your license before you vote. But if you move here, and sometimes you move and you don't get to do all those things like change your license, change your registration, you just don't get to it. So there would be a presumption with language changes that if you vote, that means you really are residing here, and we expect you to follow the same motor vehicle laws that we expect Carl to follow when he drives. And that lawsuit was filed, slightly different plaintiffs. I believe it's the same law firm, same party, a lot of the same parties. That was initially filed in state court, but that was removed to federal court. So right now the state is actually dealing with litigation in the state and federal court.
Do they have any idea of the people that were putting in votes that really shouldn't be putting in votes? I mean, I thought the groups were maybe college kids that were here from out of state, and people who were helping in the election themselves, who came to push some candidates that they liked, and they were staying, and some of them were staying in houses that our representatives lived in. And those are the two groups that I thought. I just thought.
No, I don't think that any of this is really designed for a specific group. I mean, we do know that the AG's office has gotten a few indictments over the past year for somebody who voted in Massachusetts and here, somebody else who voted in Florida and here. We've had those kind of indictments, and I think people would say under the laws we have certain things people are allowed to vote. Whether you think they should be allowed to vote is a different thing. If I have a vacation home up in the Lakes region and I say I'm here and I'm residing here,
sure,
I can go to the local poll under the law. So I'm not sure I would say that it's people who shouldn't have been voting here. I think under the way the law was written and interpreted, a lot of those people could make a representation that particular day and time when they showed up at the polling place, they resided in New Hampshire. And that's what they did.
I wonder if the root cause of all this isn't the language between residency and domicile in the various statutes that have been enacted over the years?
Well, I think that may be part of it. There was actually a constitutional convention that changed the word, and it didn't get rid of the other word, and it sort of managed to make things a little more complicated, surprisingly enough. But I don't know whether that so much of it is there are particular words that were in the law that refer to your intent to stay, and having to make an affirmative statement as to your intent to stay indefinitely. So if you're here for a sabbatical for a year, are you here indefinitely? Are you here definitely? It sort of
Are you not all there?
Are you not all there? Exactly. So there's lots of different floating components, but you're right. There were a couple of election law bills, there's litigation going on, and there were some laws passed this year that the governor has vetoed, which would undo, essentially reverse the laws, and that would mean the litigation would probably stop because then there's no point in having the litigation. The laws aren't laws anymore.
So I would think that as a resident of Nashua, which three of us are, we'd want to have the folks who vote in Nashua to live in Nashua.
Right.
And I hope that the governor's veto of these reforms will stick. I said that backwards. I hope that the
Well, the anti-reform.
the anti-reform laws, which were passed, get rejected. We stay with the reforms that you had spearheaded a couple of terms, Barbara. But I kind of wonder about this because I grew up in Chicago, And
We won't hold that against you.
I learned a lot about election law.
Yeah, really, I don't. Chicago, okay.
And so I talked to my brother who lives in the city still, and he's amazed. He says, well, Bill, when I go to vote in Chicago, I got to pull out my Illinois driver's license and that says I live in Chicago before I can vote. And that's quite a change from the old days. And I say, well, hey, Gary, why don't you come up to visit me up in Nashua for a while, stay for a week or so, and around Election Day. And
vote for me, huh?
Sometimes one vote makes a difference.
I don't know. That's what you're doing, huh?
Well, I mean,
a
I think
natural
the
state of
important
mind.
thing about that example is that our rules about voting are really very lax as to the ability to get a ballot and vote. I mean, that's really the issue. And it's not an attempt to say this group shouldn't vote or that group should vote, or that's not what's really going on. I think there's a genuine need to have rules that are applied the same to everybody so that the people who are voting here, we can have some confidence that every ballot is being cast by somebody who should. I'm sure you all have been at recounts. I know some city elections are closed. When you're recounting, because there's a 10 vote or less difference
right, yeah.
in a race, you want to have some confidence that everybody that was handed that ballot
Exactly.
really had the same stake in that vote.
There are a lot of recounts in
There are.
local elections.
Having been through a recount, I can say that the voting machines in Nashua are dead nuts on.
Yeah, they're
they're
pretty
pretty
good.
good.
Yeah, I had that.
I know in my ward we've had 3 of the races out of the 7 that I was in. We had recounts, not for me, but for some of the other people that were running in there.
If I could just say something on that, that's terrific to hear, because I've been to some national conferences, and recently in the news there was a DEF CON conference on basically geeks and computer hacks, and Harry Hursty, who I think is out of Connecticut, maybe Rhode Island, came out after the conference with a bunch of literally keys in his hands and said, voting machines, the electronic machines can be hacked. Some of these keys I got on Amazon. Electronic balloting is really not secure. I had the opportunity to go to a polling place in Tennessee actually recently and look at some of their electronic processes, but the bottom line is at the end of the day, you need a paper ballot that somebody has some confidence in, that it says correctly who you wanted to vote for. I've heard stories about programs where the touch screen vote, where you are pressing one
Yeah.
candidate, but it's actually going to another candidate, and that was fairly recently. All of these systems are subject to hack to a certain extent, and to the extent you're connected to the internet, things are really vulnerable. The New Hampshire system, quite frankly, hasn't been. Our machines are independent, and yes, there's a program that counts the ballots, but as you've said, you do the recount, and you can do it in all the elections.
The only problem we had one time where somebody I think must have been a little looped when they went in there, because there's all sorts of marks over the ballot,
Right.
and how do you figure out what it is? And
Yeah, that's a hand count.
there was like 7 ballots that were like that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, they came in at the end of the day.
Well, I don't live in
Hard.
Nashua, but I suspect we all get votes for Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck in every
Oh, yeah.
election I've
Yeah,
seen.
yeah.
It's
Probably.
called scattered when you look at the official report by the Secretary of
It is
State.
interesting to be in a recount, though, I agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah,
Gives
they,
you confidence in the system that you have that paper fallback
yeah,
that you can.
it's an audit trail.
Yeah, it builds confidence in the
Yeah.
system, so I think it's excellent.
Yeah, and when I went through my recount, which came out exactly the same as I did going in, there was a bunch of questionable ballots. People had a little dot in one and then a mark in another, so which one did they really mean, the little dot, or did they change their mind? And some of those were debatable, but the way the machine read it is took the big dot instead of the little dot, and that basically cleared up any little issues I had in my recount, which I lost by 23 votes. But it was fair.
Well, how soon, is there any kind of things that you're doing before the September 19th or 18th meetings that you're going to have? Are you meeting?
Well, different committees retained bills to
Right.
take a look at to make a decision as
I
to
see.
whether or not legislation should happen in the second year of this session. So I'm on a couple of those committees, and there are a number of those things going on right now. But generally speaking, it's a slow season.
It's not going to be so slow in a couple of
It's
weeks.
going to pick up because new bills go in September
fif-
4th through the 20th.
Right.
So that means there's going to be a lot of activity.
Right. What Doris is referring to, I think, is, you know, certainly, Bill, is that there's a time period where you get to put in a request and draft a bill to be considered come January, when everybody's sitting in those 400 seats up in that hall. And that is coming up pretty soon.
Yes,
So,
coming fast.
But
people have-
53 vetoes are a lot, too.
Yeah, there was a lot of really horrible bills this year that reversed a lot of our good intentions from previous years, and that's what the governor's really doing. But on the bills that are processed, we go through the situation with the Legislative Services Group, because you could say, well, I've got this idea, but somebody has to actually make that into a legalese format. And then if it's done properly, it's a fairly lengthy bill because you're thinking about unintended consequences and loopholes. So you want to have a comprehensive bill that can be sent to the committee, not have the committee do all the work. But some people feel that they have to justify their presence by putting in some
Oh,
know,
yes. And there's a lot left out. There's no enough detail, enough
concepts and
concerns
not
of
details.
unintended consequences from those.
Yeah.
Is there anything on the marijuana thing that's going to come up? Because when I was on that marijuana committee, and the one thing we said is that the bills should be completely thought out, because there's so many elements that have to be considered, and it would take essentially it takes the state 3 years to get ready to really handle that. And I don't think any of the stuff that was considered this last year took that into concern.
well, I mean, the marijuana legislation, it passed the House, but it was tabled in the Senate. So it didn't make it through the process.
No, but the legislation didn't even consider all the things that they had to have in place before it started, as far as I could see.
That was a pretty extensive legislation.
Yeah.
I think there was a lot, but when you're talking about a major change like that, I think probably getting everything into one bill is probably
That's
pretty optimistic.
Yeah.
You're right, it would take a while.
On that topic, it seems kind of bizarre to me that with this opioid crisis in New Hampshire, that we're passing bills to legalize opioids.
Well, I mean, people think we're diverting a huge amount of money into resources to fight the drug war, which we've been losing from their perspective. And there are people who cite statistics that say by legalizing marijuana, you put a dent in the illegal drug trade. There are people who say there are lots of benefits to marijuana, and I'm an adult, live free or die. Why shouldn't I be able to do with my body what I want? I mean, there are a lot of arguments, the practical side, as Carl mentioned, as to implementation and how do you do it, and from a policy perspective, why should we be getting involved in this? So, I mean, it's a complicated argument, and people have got a lot of opinions on that one.
And typically it comes down to a money grab from my experience looking at other states. Colorado is trying to make close to $1 billion. Nevada is looking to make $750 million. But they're having some issues now because they're a little greedy on the tax side of it. So the black market is thriving.
Oh, yeah.
And it's legal. If you're going to deal pot on the street now, you're not going to get busted for it.
Well, one of the bills, I mean, it is sort of a policy thing, and I'd be interested to hear what happens in the schools from Doris, is, there was legislation about raising the smoking age to 21. We have e-cigarettes and all of this stuff going on, and the schools have different policies on it.
did that in
What's
Nashua.
happening in Nashua?
The alderman tried to do that. There was a lot of talk about raising it, and then there were a lot of opposition. So you're saying the age of maturity for driving, for working, for drinking, for smoking is all different. Why don't we have an age of majority? I mean, so it didn't go anywhere. But,
Well, the age of rational thinking, if one wants to think adulthood, is that when we all actually get there. My husband would say he's still waiting for that day to come for me. I actually went to a seminar that argued that the brain is not fully developed until 25, and that therefore we should not be treating offenders in our criminal justice system as adults if they're 25 or under.
should they go to war?
So it raises an interesting question as to then if that truly is the science of development, does that mean we change everything to 25?
There was a bill that I heard was being put in by a Nashua senator, informing patients that you're being given an opioid in a hospital. Because I was there, they gave me a painkiller. They didn't tell me it was an opioid. Once I found out, I was livid. So are people getting addicted without even knowing what they're being given? So I was delighted when they put that through. So hopefully that went through, because you have to be informed of what your doctor's prescribing to say whether you want it or not. Because it's easily to get addicted. Well, then it should be very good on informing. So that was a loophole I thought that needed to be closed. But nothing changed on the cigarettes. They're talking about vaping now in the schools. That's a big problem.
They are, because are they vaping in the schools?
Apparently they are. We
Okay.
don't discuss it as a board, but I heard a lot about it at the Alderman board. We ask for more discussions on the board, but we get shut down because of our new board majority. So it's very disappointing that we can't get information. If I want information, I file a right to know law, a request, and then I'm told that I'm weaponizing the right to know law. So be it. Sometimes you need information. We need a new board that welcomes information and has more discussions, in my mind.
Is there a policy on smoking in the schools?
We have discipline against smoking and things
Okay.
like that, but we don't have a lot of specifics on the vaping, which is a new technology as far
Right.
as I know. But the board hasn't, they say we have discipline problems, and we're like, well, what kind of discipline problems? Break it out, and they tell us how it's racially or grade oriented. I go, that's lovely. What are the problems? I never knew what the problems were until the Board of Aldermen came out and said, let's raise the age for smoking and vaping and stuff like that. And it's like, oh, so that's what our problems are. Nice to know. But yeah, we need a new board. I think we need a new board that's more open and honest and discusses things. And
Now's
so
the time to do it. I guess people in our audience sort of consider it.
they
have
will
a few
decide.
weeks left to
I'm not
get in.
worried about it. Either they want that open discussion and they
Yeah.
will elect a board,
Definitely.
or they don't, and I'm on vacation. So
So how many openings will there be?
there are 5 openings out of 9 members. And I just hope people are informed and they get the board that they want. So
So lots of opportunity for people to sign up to run.
I expect a good dozen.
And we'll be interviewing them here on this People's View.
Well, anybody who's interested in running, you've got till next Friday to get your nomination papers into City Hall. That's for both the school board and for aldermen.
And the Board of Public Works, yeah.
And Public
And
Works, good point.
moderators.
Yeah.
There's a lot of seats that are open. And some require as few as 15 petitions. Citywide ones require 50. But it's not that hard to do. Once you talk to a few friends and have them help you get 4 or 5 each, you can get them pretty quickly.
Is that a form that you can get online?
It's online. You go to the city website, but you can't sign your own petitions. Like if Carl wants to sign my petition and Bill wants to witness it, they can. I'm not allowed to sign my own petitions. So it's a little tricky that way. You have to have help. But that's what it's all about. If you're going to get elected, you have to have support.
Sure.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for their time and for their good discussions today. Doris, Carl, Roberta, Barbara.
You're already thinking about your
Yeah.
next meeting.
I am. Yeah, I'm on deadline. So this is Bill Alm. Thank you very much for sitting in for the People's View. Take care.